As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Guys and all the listeners, today we have a living legend with us, Vijay Prashad. I had the fortunate experience to read his works and be involved and watch his videos and lectures on YouTube. One thing I've learned about going through the British school system is how we must decenter and reimagine and be committed to relearning the things that we thought and we held to be as fact. I always make reference to the false dichotomy of Malcolm X being good, Martin Luther King being good, and Malcolm X being bad. Likewise, we have many other commonly held beliefs or understandings of things that are not quite accurate. So my first question is, when we say Marxism, what do we mean?
It's a fair question. What do we mean when we say Marxism? Well, look, Marxism itself is something that develops out of the ideas of Karl Marx. He lived in the 19th century. It's a long time ago. But in the 19th century, Marx directly looked at what was going on around him. He understood this social force called capitalism, which developed amazingly the means, the productive forces. Suddenly look around you and say, oh my God, we're building bridges, building railroads. The goods that we are produced are much more than used to be produced previously, and so on. But then all these goods are being produced socially, being produced by the working people of the world. And yet at the same time, good God, inequality is rising. People are poorer. How is it that the people who produce goods are not able to enjoy them? That was Marx's question. And he discovered through his analysis that it has something to do with what he called surplus value. It has something to do with what he called the rate of exploitation, and so on. And the barrier to all this was private property, and Marxism takes as its axiom this critique of capitalism. And then, despite the fact that capitalism develops a great deal since the 19th century, this core issue remains the same. And so Marxism, of course, has developed. I mean, look, it's not the same as it was in Marx's time. We made developments trying to understand the nature of colonialism and capitalism and so on. And you can talk about that if you'd like. But the core idea of Marxism is this question of how is it possible that in a system that had produced so many goods and services, that produces so much food, for instance, you have hunger. How is it that we have enough food for people and yet billions of people are hungry? Well, what separates people from food is money. And they don't have money because they work and their surplus value is extracted, and only a few people seem to amass vast amounts of money, whereas those who even work don't. And that essentially, if I can put it in a thumbnail sketch, that's essentially Marxism.
That was a beautiful overview of Marxism. So how does that then differ to when we say communism? Or is communism Marxism in praxis?
Well, you see, communism is what the Marxists think will be the solution to capitalism. Marx, in fact, says, that communism is the solution to capitalism. Well, what is communism? Communism is a process. It's not a thing itself. It's a process. The idea is, can we produce a human society where private property doesn't divide people from each other and doesn't divide people from their means of creating a good life? A good life. That's what we want to create. We don't want to create basic needs. We don't want to create whatever this is, equality, we don't know. We want to create a good life. How do we create a good life for everybody? How do we create a good life for everybody in a planet that is sustainable, where you're not killing the planet? And in a sense, the name for that society of a good life, the name for that society where we're not killing the planet, we have given that name, and it's communism. That's what communism is. It's the solution to capitalism. It's not a theory of why capitalism is wrong, but it's its solution.
So the question is then, we always hear things like means of production, and you've mentioned twice now, or more than twice, private property. What are these terms?
Well, you see, there's one old tradition of social thought idealistic
Mm-hmm.
socialism or utopian socialism, which says, look, the key category here is that everybody should be equal, we should live in equality, and so on. But the issue is that equality doesn't come without price. Equality doesn't
Mm-hmm.
come without certain issues. Like, for instance, if you don't have electricity in the 21st century, you can't have equal rights. You can't
Yes.
just be equal because you're constitutionally equal. In other words,
Yes.
just because the constitution says that you and I are equal, that doesn't make us equal if you have electricity and I don't. So
Mm-hmm.
there's got to be a certain development of human society to produce the means of equality. So the means of production, essentially, the previous forms of wealth that enable you to make more things. For instance, if you want to build, a factory that creates, I don't know, electric wires, you need
Yes.
some wealth, prior wealth, to rent the land, to build the factory. You need to be able to create, hire the machines or buy the machines. You need to be able to hire labor, hire raw material, all that stuff. It's the means of production that enable you to do that, and those things are also then the means of production. It's the means for you to produce the electric wire which you then sell. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that's the means of production. There are also social relations of production. There are some people who have some capital which enables them to assemble the means of production, and there are other people who don't have capital, who can only sell their labor power, their ability to go and work in the factory. And that's the gap
Mm.
between the bourgeoisie, who has some capital, and the proletariat. It's a straightforward gap, and there are no complexities here. Some people have the capital to really put the means of production at play, at work, and other
Yes.
people can only sell their labor power into as one of the means of production. So that's what these concepts
Mm.
refer to, in essence.
And then, okay, now let's talk about the kind of things we hear growing up. We hear that, okay, but communism or Marxism on paper is beautiful, but in practice, it doesn't work. We hear things like the USSR, Soviet Union. We hear people say, look at the killing Stalin did, look at the failings of Mao, maybe example, or look at the failings of Trotsky or Lenin. They go, when it's in practice, trying to bring about this theory ends up with the lots of deaths of people. How would you respond?
Well, the first thing is the USSR only lasted for 70 years. It
Hmm.
didn't have such a long history and was not able to develop in a way that perhaps it might have. Secondly, the moment the revolution took place in October 1917, that's the October Revolution, the moment that happened, it was just attacked ruthlessly, by it
Mm.
was invaded by various countries, including Great Britain and so on. So they never had a chance to actually develop in a way without all the stresses and strains. Third point, the revolution took place in a backward poor country, the Russian Empire.
Mm.
All the revolutions, in fact, took place in poor countries. In Mongolia, in Vietnam, in China, in Cuba, and so on. There was no revolution in Germany or in Britain or in the United States or Canada or France or anywhere.
Mm.
These happened in poor countries. So the struggle to build socialism in a poor country, it's a huge penalty. You have to, on the one side, build the productive forces, on the other you have to create social equality. So it's not easy. The task is great and difficult and complicated. So people need to understand that it's not like a thing. Secondly, building a socialist society out of capitalism, it's not a tea party, as we say. There will be, of course, violence. Why is there violence? Because you will be attacked. I mean, Cuba, for
Mm.
instance, moment the Cuban Revolution took place, the United States tried to assault it, and till today tries to overthrow it. So there will
Yes.
be all kinds of strains and distortions that come in as a consequence of that. But I would also like to say to people who say, well, what about the killings? What about the killings? I mean, in 1943, in British colonial India, up to 3 million people died because of a famine in Bengal. 3 million people.
Yes.
And that was
Wow.
a famine that was created because of colonial policy, because you diverted food away from India in order to feed troops in Europe. That's 3 million people. That's not even a joke.
Wow.
Let's take the Congo. Half the population
Yes.
of the Congo was wiped out by King Leopold's Belgium. Half the
Yes.
population, 6 to
Wow.
10 million people. Let's talk about that. And I'm not saying let's not talk about killings and elsewhere. This is not what is sometimes called whataboutism. This is the
Yes.
straightforward issue of, are we going to face up to the fact that colonialism was a brutal, vicious system that killed millions, hundreds of millions of people, perhaps, including if you add in the people who were killed in the transatlantic trade in human
Yep.
beings? If you add all that, hundreds of millions of people killed, but more specifically, revolutions took place in poor countries. If you want to judge it like that, look at China and India. China has just abolished poverty, India is wallowing in poverty. One was a revolutionary process, the other one is total full blown capitalism. Which would you prefer?
Nah, so thanks for that. That's very important to make that distinction and add that context to it. Okay, how would you respond to some people then who say that, well, look at capitalism, it's delivered prosperity to so many countries?
It's delivered prosperity, yes, but to which classes? It's wrong to talk about prosperity to countries. It's too general. If you
Mm,
pick a country like India, for instance, about 700 million people in India, that's half the population, don't know when their next meal is coming. So
wow.
India is a prosperous country. It's a growing economy. The growth rate is high. The wealth is increased and so on. But it's a class society. So some small population is taking a lot of the social wealth, and a large section is not able to go to sleep at night with a full belly. So you can't talk about countries being prosperous. You just can't. It's inaccurate. You have to ask the question, which
Mm,
class is benefiting. Take the case of the United States of America. It's a very rich country, one of the richest countries in the world. Is it a rich country? Well, certain classes are benefiting. During the pandemic, US billionaires made, you know half a billion
exactly.
dollars or something was made just in the period of the pandemic. But the ordinary people were lining up in their cars at food banks. Now tell me, is it accurate to talk about prosperous country, rich country? I don't think so. You got to have an understanding by class. Otherwise, you miss the big stories there.
I totally am in agreement with you. But maybe some people will say then that, okay, but look what's wrong nowadays. Today we have the prospect of increasing our social mobility like none other before. So they'll say, and again, I know this is very global north centric right now, isn't it? Because they'll say, look at us in the West, we get a job, we get a promotion, we can live a good life. Like, why should I be bothered in some kind of another analysis or an alternative? Which I think is totally wrong. I think it's very selfish, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
But the question again is who?
Hmm.
Even in your friends say that we have opportunities. Who has opportunities? Where? Show me. Show me in let's say Great Britain today. How great it is, I don't know. But show me in Great Britain today who has opportunities. What
Yes.
opportunities? Tell me. I don't.
Uh, I
I'm
mean,
actually,
what
yeah.
they might say, oh, I can get a degree, I can get a master's now, and then I get a good job. I might start off with a 30K salary, get a mortgage by 3 years' time, and have a house in 25.
Okay, fine. Now who's going to pay for your college?
You take a debt, isn't it?
Yeah, you go into debt. Then what happens
Yes.
to you?
Then you pay it off
When
when
do
you
you
start
pay it
working.
off?
It takes a long time. Depends how long, what kind of job you get.
So let's talk about opportunities. You don't have
Yes.
opportunities. You are actually mortgaging your future to make your own
Mm,
opportunity there. The system is not giving you any opportunity. You are mortgaging your future to go to
hmm.
college. You have no
Yes.
guarantee of employment. You have no
Yes.
guarantee of housing. Where are you going to live? You're going to live in London? Who's going to buy your house for
Oh
you?
no, not in London. You
Yeah,
can't live
who's
in
going to
London.
buy a house for you? Where are you going to live? You're going to live in Leeds? What
Yeah.
jobs are there in Leeds? Tell me.
No,
Explain to
you're right.
me in Leeds where you're going to get a job after you've taken enormous debt to go to university in Manchester. Tell me where. What are you talking about? I mean,
Mm,
here the aspiration must be brought together with reality. I'm not saying that don't have aspirations, but
yes.
let's marry aspirations to reality. Let's not have aspirations that are impractical.
Totally in agreement with you. But again, I just want to maybe unpack that a bit further. Let's say, okay, you become a school teacher, for example. You start renting, you get a mortgage after 5, 6 years. I only say this because a lot of the time people speak about a revolution, as it were, and I'm talking about again the global north, for example, or America and the UK particularly, or Europe and America. People would say, and I'm probably in agreement, the material conditions are not there. People with all the issues they are still getting by quite okay on the average person. No.
I don't know. I mean, I actually don't. I would not be so cavalier about this because Again, the question is, what's the average person? Who is this average person that you speak of? Are there
Yes.
really average people? I mean, there was, the question must be always raised about, let's say, old deindustrialized parts of the UK.
True.
What is the average person? We're talking about a small section of people who work in finance, who work in, let's say, the high level of management that seem to be doing fine, but then everybody else seems to be entering precarious employment. What does it mean to have a future? You're a
Yes.
bike messenger in London who lives, I don't know, 2 hours outside the city because you can't afford to even pay rent in a one room apartment. I mean,
Yes.
what are we talking
Absolutely.
about? I'm not telling people don't have aspirations. I'm just saying, can your aspirations please be linked to reality?
And I feel like what you're speaking to is the lies that capitalism sells us. The capitalism literally sells a lot of people. I mean, me as a young black man, you have this aspiration of, oh, I can be a billionaire one day. And I think to myself, I think you don't know how much a billion is, and I think you don't know how unlikely it is you will become a billionaire one day. But we're sold this lie.
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing is, there's a big difference between making a living and becoming a billionaire. I think it's pretty acceptable to say, well, hey, listen, I'm going to be a billionaire. Well, if that's an aspiration, okay, fine. I mean, I'm not sure if I should wish you luck or I should give you a hug. But we're not talking about making a billionaire because that's unrealistic in the sense that
Yes.
there are 7.7 billion people on the planet, and it's ridiculous to create a utopia where we can have 7.7 billionaires. I don't even know what that would mean. It's a ridiculous, it's not practical, it's not possible.
Yes.
That's the whole 1 billion type idea is an idea of a class society. Few
Hmm.
people do well. We're talking about, can you have a good life? Can you have a
Yes.
life of dignity? Can you have a life where you have enough means for your children and yourself to live with a certain kind of gravity, where
Hmm.
you're grounded in the world and so on. Well,
Yes.
in that case, let's ask that question. And there
Okay.
again, capitalist societies are found wanting. I mean, in the middle of the pandemic, health workers, look at the UK, NHS
Yes.
workers to get a 1% raise.
Percent.
They were, in fact, promised 2 point something percent, and in the end, the government said 1%. I mean,
Hmm.
let's look at that. What is the average NHS nurse's salary in a major city? How are NHS nurses in London living? How are NHS nurses in Newcastle living? What's their life like? Go take a look. I mean, these
Exactly.
are essential workers. These are people with permanent jobs, by the way, relatively. These are not people who are working precarious jobs in one. Some of them are, but
Exactly.
not all. But they are having a hard time make a life. So the question is, what do you believe your aspiration is, and should it be grounded in reality, or should it be merely utopia where you have some anecdotal evidence that somebody who knows somebody made $1 million, euros or whatever, pounds, somebody
Yes.
who knows somebody who knows somebody, but that's not should not you should not set your goals around that.
Absolutely agreement with that. Some people will say, or another charge at communism is they want everyone to be the same. We have to be all doing the same thing. I know that's not true, but where does that even come from, or why would you respond to that?
I don't even know how to respond to that. That's the issue. Is that what does that even mean? Everybody will be doing the same thing. That's nonsense because we live in a complicated class society.
Yes.
We live in also not just a class society. We live in a complicated modern world. We have different specializations and skills, and we bring
Yes.
different pieces of our talent to create a world in unity. No, nobody says that you're all going to do the same thing or live the same life or whatever it is. The point is to emancipate ourselves from drudgery, to have a shorter working day, to live a richer life, and so on. I mean, I don't know where that comes from, honestly. Mamadou, I don't even understand what that means because it's ridiculous. I mean, our socialism is a socialism that should be in the 21st century, not in the third century
Oh,
BC.
okay.
We are
Yes.
not trying to take people back to the third century BC.
Okay. Thank you. And what when we say neoliberalism, what do we mean?
Yeah, so, until about the 1970s and 80s, there was a period where, international capital was enabled to have some growth took place, largely
Hmm.
because of vast amount of public spending, huge
Yes.
Keynesian spending. So there was a kind of growth period in that era. Then from the 1970s on, there was a crisis of productivity
Hmm.
around the world, actually, not just in the advanced industrial countries. There was a crisis of productivity for a series of reasons. And you
Hmm.
began to see the wealthy classes, you began to see the rich in many of these societies basically push an agenda where they say, look, I'm not prepared to pay taxes, and they go on what we consider a tax strike
Hmm.
from the 1970s onward, and I've been on strike for a couple of generations. There's about $40 trillion sitting in illicit tax havens.
Wow.
That's evidence of the tax strike. They're refusing to pay tax. On the other hand, because of the crisis of capitalism and the slow refusal of employers to take care of their workers, there is a huge social crisis in society. So the state had to come in and increase its social bill, to provide mental health care
Wow.
and so on and so forth. Well, if you're not collecting taxes and the social crisis is increased and the state has to increase its interventions, you have a huge budgetary problem. It's in
Yes.
that budgetary crisis globally, partly it's the third world debt crisis, that the IMF and others pushed this view that budget should be balanced and spending should be cut. So rather than raise money through taxation, raise money through privatizing state assets and so on. So neoliberalism was a solution to the tax strike by the elite, effectively.
Wow.
And the idea was that, sell your assets off, short term solutions to cover your municipal bills, not to advance the goals of society, but basically to have a balanced budget. So that essentially is neoliberalism.
Wow. Okay. And when we say, I know you mentioned it before, I should have asked earlier, what does it mean by private property? We hear that a lot as well.
Yeah, so nobody should understand the term private property to mean the clothes on your back,
Yes.
or like the books on your shelf or your car or whatever it is. You see, the issue with property is it means two things. One is the things I own, which I
Hmm.
use and which I have as my assets, like maybe if I'm in an apartment or something, and if I have
Yes.
title to it, that's my private property. Now, this private property, this kind, like the clothes I own and so on, this private property cannot make more money by
Hmm.
itself, because
Hmm.
this private property, this apartment that I'm living in, cannot then be necessarily by itself used to make money. Now,
Hmm.
I might use that apartment to go to the bank and say, this is my asset, can I borrow some money? That money that I borrow, if it's large enough, I then might invest in a factory. Now, that quantum of money is known as capital. That's not
Hmm.
money. Money is what I have in my bank account. When I have a quantum of money that can be utilized to invest in something to make more money, that amount of money is called capital. And that
Hmm.
capital is private property. That capital is private
Mm.
property. That those big assets that by themselves can generate more wealth, that asset is private property. You see, if my home that I own, let's say I own a home and its value increases, that's actually not the same as capital.
Oh,
It's not exact, because I'm living in the home. Now
yes.
when I sell it, then it has actually become an asset. The only time something is a commodity is if it's traded. If you're going to
Okay.
live in a house, it's not a traded asset. It's a place where you live. Only
So when we
when
say
you. Mhm.
abolishing private property, sorry to cut you off. When we say
Please.
abolishing private property, what are we abolishing? What does that look like today? What's an example of private property we could point to and say this shouldn't be private property?
Well, let's take a couple of examples at different levels. For instance, do you really, really need to privatize the rail system in Britain? Do you really need Virgin to have a private control over rails? Why not
No.
abolish private control of public transport, of any
Hmm.
transportation system, and have it be in the public good, democratically run? Maybe a parastatal entity that runs trains, that runs subway system. I mean, look, in London, why should you have to buy tickets to ride the tube? You don't
Yes.
need to. It should be just something that's there as the public good, like walking on the
Yes.
sidewalk.
Yes.
The tube essentially is a faster way to walk on the sidewalk. It should be
Yes.
totally when you go to Hong Kong, Hong Kong, because it's a hilly city, there are
Hmm.
very many places where instead of having to climb up a hill, they have escalators, like in an airport or in a
Hmm.
mall or whatever. So it's an outdoor escalator. You
Yes.
step on the escalator, it has a roof, and it takes you up the hill, and you can exit at different streets and so on. You don't have to buy a ticket to ride the escalator. You just get on because it's funded democratically by taxation and so on. So
Hmm.
here you don't need to private. Imagine if they privatize these escalators, and every time you wanted to go up to your house, you had to pay some money to go up and to a private entity. Why? I already pay taxes, and these are
Yes.
my social goods that I get as a consequence of taxes. So one thing is there, that this is, we can decommodify a number of things. We
Mm.
can decommodify transportation, we decommodify health, we decommodify education and so on. You don't have to pay for education. That should be part of the public good. That should be paid collectively, socially, as through taxation and various other means.
I mean,
Okay, so
everything
yeah.
you said is so sorry, sorry. Everything you said is so amazing. I will let you carry on, but why do you think there's so much pushback against like Marxism and communism? Is it just Western propaganda?
I mean, I don't want to, honestly, I don't want to speculate. You should ask that question to those who say that this is all nonsense. Why should I go the other direction, and I'm giving you a certain viewpoint, right? Now, why
Yes.
should I say that other people don't agree? That's bizarre. You'll have to ask them, why do you not agree? Do you understand what I mean?
You're right. Yes.
Why should I do that? That's not, I think it's perfectly reasonable. That's why I'm telling you.
Yes.
So I can't answer it. But just to finish this point about private property, one is
Yes.
decommodifying aspects of social life. The other is in the productive sector. Do
Hmm.
you really need private control over electricity generation? Is that necessary? I mean, do you need the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, to be in the private sector? Because, for instance, most of the capital that a pharmaceutical company raises,
Hmm.
most of the capital doesn't come from their own risk. They don't take a risk. They are given
Mm.
capital by the state. The government provides these pharmaceutical companies with money to do research, whether it's through universities or they give them a direct grant to go and test medicines before it goes on the market and so on. So there's no
Hmm.
need to have, like, the capital that's raised for a pharmaceutical company is often public money. So why is
Yes.
there a need then to have that be privately appropriated? Why not just have that in the public domain? I mean, I don't get it, right? So that's what
Absolutely.
I would say, that I would say very strongly that when we say abolish private property, we are saying abolish the private sector's use of public money for private appropriation.
Thank you so much. We Western media will call the likes of AOC and Bernie Sanders socialists, and then some will say no, they're social democrats. What's the difference between these two? And do you feel like the likes of AOC and Bernie Sanders actually water down the definition of socialist?
No, I mean, I don't actually accept that. I think that at a time of weakness of the left movement, it's important to have the widest possible, approach to these questions. People can
Mm.
disagree, and that's fine, but we have to have a kind of comradely spirit. Firstly,
Okay.
they self-designate as socialists. So who are we? There's no Vatican of the socialism where you excommunicate people. I find that attitude very bad. People take a position you don't agree with, you can argue on the position. You can't say, oh, they are not real, this or that.
Wow.
You can argue on the positions. They may have a more conciliatory approach. That's okay. Let them go as far as they go. I don't condemn people because they are not identical to me. It's a totally undemocratic approach to the socialist tradition. You've got to
Hmm.
have a broad approach. Jeremy Corbyn is a very serious and dignified person. He has his own approach. We'll walk with him as far as he goes, and we may walk further than him. But we are not
Yes.
going to condemn him and say, you can't walk with me. That's ridiculous. That's not a society I want to live in. I want to live in a
Mm.
democratic society where people of different views are respected. We build on views. We don't, we are not, again, we don't build our views to condemn or not condemn people. I just don't like that attitude. Personally,
Thank
I
you.
don't like that. Yeah.
No, I'm totally agreement with you. And I feel like sometimes maybe the kind of people on the left you see online do engage maybe sometimes a bit of cult personality worship, which is a bit unfortunate. I do have just three more questions. I have four actually. First one is I'm a Muslim, and sometimes we hear people from who share my faith who push back against Marxism. And I feel like, if I'm honest with you, a lot of the time they actually haven't read Marx, but they say that Marxism worldview would abolish religion.
I mean, well, it's not untrue that there is a tense relationship with religious traditions, but the question is
Hmm.
what religious traditions? The problem is most of the religious traditions in the world are highly undemocratic in their own
Hmm.
structures. So I would like to live in a world where even religious organizations are democratic, where there is accountability. I mean, why should you have somebody just because they are sanctified by faith be the permanent
Hmm.
leader of that faith? What about so-called right to recall of an imam? I mean, an imam
Yes.
takes a retrograde. I mean, we need to democratize our traditions. Why should an imam be allowed to talk against homosexuality, or why should an imam be allowed
Hmm.
to do this? Where is the who are they accountable to? Now
Yes.
they can turn around and say I'm accountable to Allah. That's fine. But I mean, how are you, where do you get the right to be in direct communication? That is, to my mind, an apostatic, that's not a correct approach. And why is it then there are six different opinions in a faith? Where is the place of reasonable rational discussion? So
Hmm.
religion must also confront rationality, it must also confront democracy. I think that's about where the Marxist tradition goes with religion. Not necessarily going to abolish religion, but I would certainly abolish religion as it is today, where there's a lot of superstition peddled, where there's a lot of wrong, unscientific ideas peddled. Religion
Hmm.
should not see itself as outside science, democracy, and reason. It should be committed to building traditions, with these
Even with
other
the
discourses. Yeah.
sanctity of certain texts, for example. Let's say the scripture says one thing. Why can't? Wouldn't the argument or pushback be, well, we don't agree with condemning certain people who we disagree with, but this is what our faith says, for example.
I mean, what does it mean to say our faith says that? I mean,
Hmm.
nobody has, I mean, it's very clear that this is why we have traditions like hermeneutics in every faith,
Yes, exactly.
the study of texts and so on. The text doesn't speak without the need of mediation.
Hmm.
No religious tradition, if it's honest with itself, says that the priest has an unmediated contact with God. That
Yes.
itself is a heretical claim. You'll
Yes.
remember that, what did Halaj say? Halaj said, Ain al Haq. And what
Yes.
happened to Al Halaj? Al Halaj was then crucified because he said,
Yes.
I am the truth. Really? I mean, what gives you the right to be the truth? That to me is a troubling thing. Nobody is the truth. We are human beings struggling to be better people. And I
Hmm.
think religion is part of that struggle, but it doesn't get a free pass. I wouldn't say, oh, okay, it's religious, I should respect it. Why? Why should I respect a tradition if it's unwilling to interrogate its own premises, its own attitudes, and so on? If there is somebody who is, let's say, from with slightly different views, how to engage it? This is
Yes.
not the time for people of reason to practice takia when it comes to religion. We need to be clear, we need
Absolutely.
to be straightforward, we need to say the truth. And I'm telling you the truth. I would say to my religious friends, how do you interrogate your faith in relationship to democracy and reason?
Hmm. No, thank you. That's beautiful. You mentioned a lot about Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba and many other Pan African leaders. My question is, why do you feel these Pan African leaders were attracted to Marxism?
Because it helped them advance the cause of their movement. I mean, they didn't come to Marxism out of nostalgia or out of, Moscow gold or anything. They
Hmm.
saw that the critique of imperialism, the critique of capitalism was very well developed. It was useful. They must have found it useful. We'll have to check with them. But as far as I know, in the writings, particularly of Sankara, it was very clear to our dear comrade that there was some great element of truth in the Marxist tradition. And the Marxist tradition was useful to Sankara to advance the project in Burkina Faso. So that's what I
Hmm.
think attracted them. It was not some nostalgic or romantic thing, it was the practicality of the Marxist critique that was appealing.
Yes, I often say that. Same thing with like the Black Panthers, for example. They just found a critique that worked for them. So my final two questions from actually my friend, I want to give him a shout out, Christian Joseph, who actually he's the one that led me to your work. So
Mhm.
he asked, Is there an opportunity being presented to the third world given that America is an empire in economic decline despite its military dominance?
I mean, it depends on what we mean in the third world, because every country has different kinds of governments. And then, in a sense, the movements are also not clear about where we stand and so on. Right now, the emergence of the Chinese project has certainly put pressure on the United States, certainly,
Hmm.
without a doubt.
Yes.
And this provides countries with the opportunity to take a kind of non aligned approach again.
Yes.
This opportunity must be taken. Nobody should ally fundamentally with China or fundamentally with the US. I think this is an opportunity for a non aligned approach. And in fact, by the way, the Chinese government openly says that, look, you don't need to be sign up for some alliance. You need to have your own foreign policy. You need to make
Mm,
the most of whatever is available to you. And so I would say it's an opportunity, but countries should not fall prey to the US government's attempt to blackmail them into linking only with the US against China. I think that's the real issue on the table.
okay. And last question was, in the West, the problem of police brutality has been brought to our attention within our context. What is the function of policing in the global South, and how does it relate to what we've seen in the global North?
See, again, this has to do with which countries and what's the class alignment in a country. In
Hmm.
some countries, you have the police, which is basically a cognate of the working of the ruling class.
Hmm.
A police in a country like India, for instance, is very brutal when the farmers protest and so on. In
Yes.
another country like in Cuba, for instance, there's also a police force, but it has a different class content. You can't just
Hmm.
say a cab. In some
Yes.
universal way. I mean, ACAB universally. No, no. You have to look at what is the class content of the state. How is the
Mhm.
state's approaching the people? What does it understand? And then the police has to be understood in that context. So I would say there's no general theory of police globally. It's all about the class situation.
Okay, thank you. And the final question. Some people, traditionally black nationalists, who I am, for the record, in vehemently disagreement with those with black nationalists, but then they level a critique at Marxism and say that it's too class reductionist. It doesn't take into consideration race.
Well, I have only one thing to say to you, which is you should read the Tricontinental dossier called Dawn,
Hmm.
which goes into some of this. And well, I said I'll only say one thing, but I'll say two. The second is that in Marx's Capital, written in 1867, he has a line that I'd like people to reflect on. He says that in Capital, written in 1867, mind you, he
Hmm.
says that workers in white skin cannot be emancipated as long as workers in black skin are held in bondage. That's in Capital 1867. Now you
And
tell
that
me that it's class reductionist.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing conversation. Guys, I will leave Vijay Prashad's social media in the description of this episode. Please like, comment, subscribe, be that on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcast. You're listening to Mamadou on The Malcolm Effect. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Great to be with you.